Thank you very much for having me. My name is Tom Livingstone, and I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Mandy Rose, Beyond the God Trick, Multisensory Storytelling and Documentary Epistemology. As immersive media develops, creative technologies and the creative practices that they enable are introducing forms of multisensory experience which displace the visuality that has dominated media to date. Immersive media experiences can be multimodal and multisensory, with content reaching us not just through our eyes and ears, but through forms of embodied experience, including smell, touch, and proprioception. These mediated forms of sensory engagement now intersect with documentary themes within virtual reality, mixed reality, and augmented reality experiences. Our presentation today discusses some landmark non-fiction immersive projects that harness the opportunities represented by these multisensory registers. Our work is part of My World, a project supported by the UKRI Strengthen Places Fund that's driving innovation in the creative technology sector in the southwest of England. The work that we're presenting today reflects a research strand we're calling multisensory storytelling. The research focus was prompted by My World's investment in a number of projects by UK creative agencies, All Seeing Eye, Marshmallow Laser Feast and Air Giants amongst them, that are multimodal and multisensory, and our observation that immersive stories are increasingly reaching us through forms of embodied experience beyond the horizons of oculocentrism. So what's at stake in multisensory storytelling? Oculocentrism, that is the prioritization of the visuality and visual experience as the core feature of subjectivity, is largely inseparable from most accounts of media history. And that's thanks to its imbrication with the technologies and techniques of perspective. In the broadest possible terms, the formalization of perspective has been described as, quote, the most important event in the Renaissance. That's William Ivins from 1939. As a means of representing objects and their relations in space, perspective was a key technique of empirical science, architecture, engineering, and of course figurative painting, as well as all the epistemologies that emerged in the wake of those technologies of vision. Among recent theorists, 𝗵𝗂𝘆 sees a step change in the epistemic and socio-political power of perspective when it becomes automated through technologies such as the camera. The dominance of perspective and photography is also tied to the dominance of visuality in thinking about knowledge and the human sensorium. The over-indexing of the visual results in an under-consideration of other modalities. Touch, taste, and smell, as well as proprioceptive and interoceptive systems, sit far below sight and hearing in the dominant understanding of how cognition operates in a densely mediated environment, and they've therefore been marginalized in mainstream documentary practice. A shift away from the audiovisual as the sole sensory interface for media was evident, however, from the earliest days of what we now call the third wave of virtual reality. A year before the launch of the Oculus Rift Developer Kit made VR accessible to a generation of creators, journalism fellow Noni de la Peña hacked together a VR system to bring Hunger in LA, a VR non-fiction work, to the Sundance Festival. Suddenly, media was not something you could consume seated, but was instead something that you could walk around in. Hunger in LA is a room-scale VR experience recreating the scene of a medical emergency outside of an LA food bank. When the person queuing next to you goes into a diabetic seizure, participants remark on the physicality of their reaction. It's common for people to reach out to help the CGI avatar, for example. The impact of the experience is detached from any particular sense of visual verisimilitude. The animation and rendering of the piece is by today's standards relatively crude. Instead, the veracity of the document is channeled through the audio track, featuring uncut verite audio recorded at a food line. A sense of full-bodied presence enabled by the 6 degrees of freedom format reignites the immersant's bodily self-awareness, their proprioception, in a fashion that is largely absent from passive, linear screen experiences, but totally appropriate to a piece of non-fiction aimed to galvanize the people who experience it. Here, despite images which are certainly not lifelike, the participant may still experience a form of what Mandy Rose has identified as a corporeal realism that can engage them in an embodied witnessing in relation to the real. For de la Peña, and this is a long quote, these sensations of presence can only be achieved if the changes in the virtual environment happen in real time. That is, if the viewer participant is allowed to move freely while the digital environment changes visually and aurally in exact keeping with gaze, location and body position. By using both the body and the kairos of a real-time delivery to create an empathetic connection, a new embodied digital rhetoric emerges for framing persuasive arguments. The experience of hunger in LA stands in sharp contrast to the disembodiment, which was the hallmark of participant experience in numerous 360-degree video, aka cinematic VR experiences that quickly emerged after the Oculus Rift development kit was released. Yet, creators working with 360-degree video look to other sensory modalities to enhance the immersivity of these experiences. Founded by Grace Boyle in 2015, the 𝗵𝗄𝘁, named after Aldous Huxley's multisensory cinema and Brave New World, is a studio focused on developing approaches to creating immersive works that are, quote, multisensory from first concept. The studio serves as a vehicle for this work and also for wider collaboration. The 𝗵𝗄𝘁's first major work was Munduruku, The Fight to Defend the Heart of the Amazon from 2017, a cinematic VR work that Boyle directed with James Manistey in collaboration with Greenpeace and Alchemy VR. The project, reflecting the struggle of the Munduruku people against incursions on their land, mining, industrialization, road building, was designed to foster understanding between urban and indigenous communities in Brazil and to generate public support for the Munduruku globally. The olfactory narrative, as Boyle calls it, mimics local smells, including a jungle aroma and the metallic smell of machinery. Meanwhile, wind, heat, and infrasonics, palpable low-frequency sounds, are also deployed during the experience. Boyle is also concerned with the sort of cross-modality, so how senses combine to make feelings. It's important to say that the 𝗵𝗄𝘁s don't seek to create a realistic sensorium. They seek rather to deploy sensory juxtaposition in order to choreograph emotionally meaningful responses, which, in a non-fiction context, places the experience outside of the realm of mere facts. As the creative and exhibition infrastructure for a multisensory 360-degree video experience didn't yet exist, the production involved the creation of custom devices which allowed scent to appear and disappear, as well as a bespoke single-person 360-degree multisensory theatre in which to show the work. Boyle, who previously worked as an environmental researcher and communications specialist at Greenpeace, is interested in the untapped potential of the senses, overlooked within media to date, to engage audiences in learning, memory, value judgments, and more. Incorporating senses other than vision and hearing, particularly smell, which is highly connected to parts of the brain concerned with memory and emotion, sort of into her storytelling is for her a way of engendering the deep engagement that can prompt people not just to change their minds, but to act. At the 𝗵𝗄𝘁s, Boyle says, we want to create stories that speak to all of your senses, quote, that you can inhabit as an embodied creature with embodied cognition. Beyond the continued presence of the audio-visual, the most common sensory modality in immersive non-fiction is touch. Haptic interfaces are now pretty much everywhere and were key to the interactive documentaries that emerged in the 2000s. With haptics integrated into VR through hand controllers in devices such as Meta's Quest, the HTC Vive, and of course Apple Vision Pro, haptics have been central to immersive non-fiction works for a decade. Winner of Best VR Immersive Work at the 78th Venice International Film Festival and nominated for a News and Documentary Emmy Award, 𝗵𝗵𝘃, Playing with Reality, is the best-known work from renowned British immersive studio Anagram. Narrated by Tilda Swinton, the project uses CGI and a first-person account by John, aka 𝗵𝗃, of his challenging family background, mental health crisis, years isolated in psychiatric institutions with a schizophrenia diagnosis, and the vital support and connection he found in multiplayer games. Available to download via the Oculus Store, now the Meta Quest platform, and thus accessible to gamers, the project neatly integrates form and content in using the tools, platforms, visual grammar, and aesthetics of a video game to explore the world of gaming. Participants use hand controllers to navigate through 𝗵𝗃's story. Along the way, the interactive experience also offers insight into psychosis by illustrating the fragility of our internal self-model, with the expected relationships between haptic, auditory and visual inputs and outputs at times breaking down. Reflecting VR's noteworthy capacity for perspective taking, 𝗵𝗐 said, quote, "By turns gripping, sad and poignant, 𝗵𝗏 is one of the great moving image attempts to understand mental illness from the inside out." And of course, it's worth noting that it's not just a moving image, a sequence of moving images that create the inside-outness of the experience. Marshmallow Laserfeast's VR trilogy In the Eyes of the Animal, 𝗵𝗏𝘁𝗿, and We Live in an Ocean of Air explore VR as a platform to engage multiple senses in order to provide a fresh encounter with aspects of the non-human world. The first work in the trilogy, In the Eyes of the Animal, arose from a residency supported by the abandoned Normal Festival devices in the 𝗕żdale Forest in the English Lake District. The team sought to, quote, "explore the sensory perspectives of the animals that lived there by taking physical samples for the headsets, sonic samples for the soundtrack, and a 360-degree LiDAR scan, a digital sample of the environment too. The resulting experience offers an expressive interpretation of the perspectives of 4 forest species: mosquito, dragonfly, owl, and frog. Among non-fiction producers exploring how VR platforms might allow encounters with aspects of the more than human through forms of technologically mediated embodiment, Marshmallow Laserfeast stand out for the scale, ambition, and extent of their work. So within the VR headset, the participant is invited to choose one of the animal perspectives and finds herself immersed in an entrancing visual world, seeing as if through the eyes of one of these woodland creatures. Meanwhile, they experience bodily sensation through a sub-pack, a device worn as a kind of haptic jacket that converts audio inputs into tactile outputs, so that in the dragonfly section of the work, for example, they experience a buzzing sensation, and in the frog section, a deep throbbing. Marshmallow Laserfeast also engaged other senses in the experience. When the piece was first exhibited in the 𝗕żdale Forest, it was presented at the end of a forest walk, and the physical elements of the forest, the moss, grass, the forest floor itself, were integrated into the experience through touch and smell, creating the type of hybrid physical-digital experience commonly now known as mixed reality. In 𝗵𝗏𝘁𝗿 2017, a mixed reality installation that celebrates the Californian native giant sequoia tree, launched 2 years later, Marshmallow Laserfeast developed their exploration of the multisensory potential of immersive documentary. Donning a VR headset, the immersion leans into a cavity within a foam model of a section of a sequoia. Scent is dispensed within the headset, custom made to evoke the forest. Visuals show a giant sequoia scanned through LiDAR, first seen from outside and then from within. As computer graphics visualize water and nutrients flowing up through the trunk to the leaves, the embodied experience of hugging the tree melds with the visuals and the scent, and the immersant feels as if swept up in the life-sustaining processes within this huge ancient being. In 360-degree video cinematic VR experiences, despite the discourse of being there, the disembodied eye is still the locus of knowledge, while the rest of the body plays little role at all. In 𝗵𝗏𝘁𝗿, by contrast, interactive media technology engages the body in multiple sensory registers, with sight, scent, and touch all at play. And commentators have discussed the tension between presence and absence that is a feature of immersion with 360-degree video. But in 𝗵𝗏𝘁𝗿, this tension is allayed with these multiple sensory modalities operating as a form of suture within the experience. A more recent Marshmallow Laserfeast production, 𝗵𝗶𝘆, is a multi-person experience that places the immersant inside a breathing cell in a journey of life and breath via real-time particle simulation, room-scale VR with multiple sensor arrays in place to translate the movements of your fellow participants in real time. The piece is an involution of embodiment, an exercise in, quote, interbeing, using the immersion of our bodies within a piece about the processes internal to our body to ask, as one reviewer put it, are you breathing air, or is the world remaking itself in miniature inside you? The piece is premised on the interdependence of all scales of phenomena in the natural world, and in this vein doesn't disregard the visual as a means of conveying experience, but instead, with its plethora of multisensory inputs, unseats the visual from the pinnacle of the hierarchization of the senses. But the question remains, what's at stake for documentary practice in this evolving and expanding multisensory landscape? Now, there's a long tradition of thinking about embodied epistemologies, even as it relates to immersive media. Laura Marx is a noticed theorist in this regard, building on the Frankfurt School's privileging of sensuous knowledge as opposed to the optical unconscious as a form of, the Frankfurt School understood sensuous knowledge as a form of non-alienated experience, thus sort of placing it on a pedestal above alienated experiences. Marx takes this idea and calls the form of knowledge derived from embodiment tactile epistemologies. And this is an idea that has been picked up and expanded by my colleague Mandy Rose. Laura Marx writes that these tactile epistemologies conceive of knowledge as something gained not on the model of vision, with its connotations of dominance, but through physical contact. Applying the idea of tactile epistemologies to the experience of 𝗕𝗏𝘃𝗃, for example, we can think of meaning as emerging as the immersant explores their media environment and pays attention to the effects that their multisensory interaction produces. The embrace, which is the central experience of 𝗕𝗏𝘃𝗃, provides a particularly apt instance of this form of knowledge production that Marx has called a compassionate involvement with the world, or what Michael Taussig has termed a yielding knowing. We might think of tactile epistemologies through another theoretical prism too. In her seminal 1988 essay, the feminist historian of science, Donna Haraway, addresses, quote, the curious and inescapable term objectivity, honing in on the visual as the prime locus of the universal truth claims that arise from, quote, the God trick of seeing everything from nowhere, end quote. Haraway makes a case instead for, quote, the politics and epistemologies of location, positionality, and situating, where partiality and not universality is the condition of being heard to make rational knowledge claims. Within this context, she asks, what sensory powers do we wish to cultivate other than vision? And that's a question that's extremely relevant to multisensory nonfiction. For in these immersive nonfiction experiences that disrupt media's traditional centering of the visual in place of multisensory modalities, we can see how Haraway's vision of situated knowledges might inform and critique our shared world, albeit in a setting where the situations, relational dynamics, and interactions that prompt new knowledges are virtual. Nevertheless, these virtual environments, within these virtual environments, knowledge and understanding is accrued experientially and across our embodied sensory registers. This methodology has an impact that is derived perhaps from its distance from the old hackneyed rhetoric of the documentarian's objectivity, the God trick that sees everything from nowhere and therefore finds itself insufficient to ways of being and knowing that arise out of entanglement, situatedness, and the complex relationality between the knower and the known. To drive home the importance of recent innovations in multisensory storytelling, we'd like to conclude by gesturing to how the creative strategies associated with tactile epistemologies don't just open up new ways of knowing the world around us, but also within the field of universal design are increasingly generating new ways in which people, for example the blind deaf community, who are for the most part unaddressed by audiovisual media, can encounter media experiences in a way that does not place anyone, no matter their sensory profile, at a disadvantage in terms of accessing and appreciating a given piece. This seam of work offers an opportunity to reframe how immersive media is not only experienced, but developed and produced. Specifically, accessibility need not be a retroactive and adaptive process, i.e. we've made this film, now how can we add audio description, but rather something that is integral to how the experience is made. Media experiences, for example, that are designed for a deaf-blind audience could be, to borrow a phrase from our colleague Mike Richardson, whose research looked at sensory substitution technologies, recorded in tactile. Within the My World project, we're now working on a case study of a new work by award-winning immersive artist 𝗵𝗱𝘃𝗁. Inside is a VR experience being produced with creative agency 𝗚ll-𝐶eeing eye. The work is a biography of the renowned US sculptor Judith Scott, who was born with Down syndrome and profoundly deaf. 𝗴's multisensory biography will respond to the provocation, how might we tell Judith Scott's story in a way that would be accessible to her were she alive to see it? This new work, for which 𝗴's is working with neurodivergent performers, is already yielding insights into how emergent tools associated with the expanded sensory registers that we've been discussing can support inclusive production. With the opportunity to follow inside from concept to delivery, we will track, analyse and develop a multifaceted view of the applications of multisensory technology in this significant new work, which eschews not only the power dynamics inherent to photographic objectivity, but the exclusionary impact of a media landscape that prioritises vision and visuality over other sensory modalities and their knowledge-making capacities. And it's with this case study that we wish to return at next year's iteration of this conference. Thank you very much for your time.